Hey everybody, welcome back to the internet. I've pulled two long stories from r/ProRevenge today, so we're gonna just read some fun revenge stories. By the way, I don't even read a lot of these stories before making the video about them, so my reaction to reading them is the same as yours to hearing them. So this first one is called The Neighborhood Remembers, The Neighborhood Punishes. This is a story I've been sitting on for a few years now, and I've discovered r/ProRevenge a couple months ago. I decided it's finally time to let the world know what happened to a sociopath who dared to cross the neighborhood. To set the stage, I used to live in a big but not huge city. Let's call it Palmville. I lived near the corner of a dense suburb nestled between overstuffed apartment buildings, a river that smelled like diesel when at low tide, and two busy highways. I was a minority in this neighborhood, and I caught a lot of heat for it. People didn't really like white people there, but enough of our neighbors were accepting of us. Aside from a few disagreements between families and the beatings that came with them, I don't feel like I was in danger when leaving my home. It was a rough neighborhood, but it was my home, and it protected its own. The community center was like a temple, and let's call her AM, was the priestess. In our neighborhood, she was respected like a living deity, and her calm and understanding reflected her status. I never once saw her behave without a strong moral code. And the final piece to set the stage, our former landlord, short Asian lady in all the stereotypical ways, kind and sweet. Our house was above my parents' pay grade, and she knew it. She went out of her way to find house repair and maintenance jobs for tenants that were having money problems. She'd pay them back, taking chunks out of their rent, oftentimes a bit larger than how much the work they did was worth. Looking back, that was probably illegal, but that's irrelevant because she died. The circumstances surrounding her death were suspect, but none of the suspects play a part in this story, so there's no need to go into detail on it. Her sons, who wanted nothing to do with the real estate, took over the business. They couldn't make heads or tails of how she managed to float books with so much red in them and began dumping properties. Ours was on that list. I harbor no ill will towards them, and I still wish them the best, but the guy who bought the house, enter the sociopath and today's victim. This guy wasted no time in making our lives hell. His first action was to raise the rent. Apparently when the account had changed, he was allowed to update the rent to modern pricing. We'd been there for several years and were paying below market even from the onset, so this was a huge blow by itself. The second blow came when the rent had to be ready in full on the first of the month. No partial payments, no work to reduce it, no extensions. Full rent on the first month or the eviction notice on the second. This was hemorrhaging our savings, but we were surviving for the moment. Meanwhile, AM had lobbied hard for the city to co-fund a revival project to renovate the entire aging suburbs as she succeeded. One street at a time had conga lines of work trucks, and almost every day people were getting old leaky pipes replaced, sinkholes in the yards patched, fences repaired, paint renewed. It was an amazing thing, and an enticing thing for the sociopath. Being at the corner of the neighborhood, our house was on the last street of the list, and Sociopath wanted us out so he could relist the house after renovation. He never said this directly, but multiple conversations made his intent clear even for 10-year-old me. Random inspections, overhyping of minor problems with the house, even so far as to bring us up on completely false animal abuse charges because our cat was attacked by what we believe was a raccoon, and he tried to claim that we did it. Yeah, because a vet can't figure out what the difference between a knife wound and a mauling. We read the writing on the wall and began preparations to move. We decided to move in with my oldest brother in a place I'll call Banjo Land. Most of us had moved except my older brother, who stayed behind because he still had a lot of social ties in Palmville, and his new job meant if he cut corners, he could keep paying Sociopath's inflated bills. Well, despite his best efforts, he came up $20 short one month and Sociopath jumped on it. He had 30 days. We made the 400-mile trip from Banjo Land to Palmville to get the rest of our stuff, and I can't say I approved of my brother's living conditions. But I guess that's beside the point. The month passed rather uneventfully. I guess Sociopath figured he'd won, so there was no need to burn the gas to drive out and gloat. The neighborhood had learned what was going on, and that was the first time I'd ever been back in that neighborhood where I didn't get a single call out, a single glare, a single racist remark. Everybody behaved reverently. It was kind of disturbing in all honesty. I guess people in lower incomes all know what eviction means and felt like I was having a bad enough time already. Well, 20 days later, he says it's time to leave. We still had a week left, but it didn't matter. We didn't have the money to try fighting it with a lawyer. AM descended from the heavens and bought us a couple extra days. but it was evident he really wanted us out, possibly because the work trucks were now one street away. The last time I ever saw the house I grew up in, workmen were throwing my childhood possessions into a large bin where we supposedly still had 3 days left to leave. Everything that follows is a collection of information that I got through the grapevine and phone calls with people present at the events. Immediately, Sociopath moved into the house himself. Why, you may ask? People who owned the homes they were living in were getting the full cost of renovations comped by the city. He figured that by moving in himself, he'd be able to get the house he bought at liquidation price renovated for free and then flip it. AM was having none of it. She explained to him that at the time of the revival project was approved, the house was a rental lot, and they can't change the budget now. She then explained to him that the partial cost coverage that had been approved for the lot was in our name, not his, and he wasn't eligible for partial cost comping either. He'd have to pay every penny himself, and since the entire neighborhood was getting a facelift, he was required to at least renovate the exterior. Otherwise, she'd see the house condemned as an eyesore or a dilapidated or whatever the legal term is. He went really cheap on the renovations, basically put up new carpets and a coat of paint. This would later come to bite him in the butt. He then began trying to sell the house in earnest. The neighborhood remembered what he'd done. There were vandalisms when nobody was there, and loud noises from the neighbors when people were there to look the house over. And any time a prospective buyer asked around, they got the full stink eye from anybody they talked to. They made sure he simply couldn't get that house sold at market value. After 3 months of this, he lowered the listing price. Then a month later he lowered it again, and finally got a bite. AM personally made sure he had to file every single piece of paperwork before it changed hands. Every single part of the house had to be inspected thoroughly. And that's when Karma herself caught up with him. In his hasty, cheap renovations, he somehow damaged the pipes. Black mold. AM remembered how he'd treated us, and she decided to pay him back in kind. I never heard how exactly she pulled it off, but she managed to delay him getting the news about the black mold being discovered for several days. Long enough that by the time he did get the news, he didn't have time left to try getting it cleaned or make a last-ditch effort to save the house. The house was condemned days later. In their final act, AM and members of the neighborhood filed every single complaint and injunction they could and arranged for him to be compelled by the city to demolish the house immediately. A cost he had to pay out of his own pocket. He tried to destroy a family and broke laws just to make some quick cash, and instead was left fighting a year-long legal battle and ended up losing thousands. The neighborhood remembers, the neighborhood punishes. Well, I mean, it is kind of satisfying to know that when people act like this, they get what they deserve. The moral of these stories is just don't be a jerk, don't ruin people's lives, and they won't try and ruin yours back. Alright, now for the second story. This one is called Not My Fault You Can't Be Bothered to Do Your Job. To be honest, I never thought this would go as far as it did, and I probably wouldn't have done it if I had known what would have happened. Oh well though, it was freaking awesome. So I used to work at an entertainment park when I was 17. It was a minimum wage, 0-hour contract, and only seasonal. But I lived in a severely deprived area with very high levels of underemployment, so I was thrilled to have a job at all. Specifically, I worked in the soft play center, which was also attached to other activities around the park, such as the bouncy castle, face paint station, and the people who walk around with those enormous bundles of overpriced balloons. Despite it being a kick in the throat, selling one balloon would pay for my first hour's wage. It was my favorite job, and I was good at it. You got to wander around the park, talk to customers, and in general it was just more pleasant than being stuck in a smelly child's play area with their bratty parents. Since I regularly topped the sales in this department, I was always written in to sell balloons on any day when the weather allowed it. I was living the life. There was this woman, I'll call her Kay, who really didn't like this. She'd always liked being on balloons, but after becoming pregnant, they decided it would be best for her to just stay within the soft play area. She would use her pregnancy to try and get away with everything. If you needed to get past her and she refused to move, the second you tried to get past her, at the slightest nudge, she was being barged into, which would damage the baby, and she refused to do parties because they were too stressful. Her parents were very wealthy, which is one of the reasons I don't feel so guilty for what I did, and would pay to come in to see her. She would then use that as a way to get out of doing anything for an hour or more whilst they chatted. A few weeks into the season, our manager injured himself and was unable to come into work. As a result, a manager from a separate department was put in charge, and he wasn't aware of Kay's ban on balloons. One day I was in the back room filling up balloons with helium and tying them off. It's annoying since you have to keep a hold of all of them and it takes a lot of fiddling. Eventually I'd prepare maybe 50 balloons and get ready to head out into the park. I knew that it wasn't very busy, so the bundle would probably last me the day, and I would be able to have a nice calm day. Unfortunately, however, before I got to the exit, I was swiftly overtaken by Kay, who ripped the balloons from my hands and ordered me back into the kitchen. I was left stunned and could only trundle back to the soft play area's kitchen, where I was swiftly put to work doing pots. This continued for the next 3 weeks, and I was sick of it. But then it started to get busier. Instead of what lot of balloons lasting a day, they had been replenished when stock ran low. I noticed that Kay would never come in to get any more balloons, which seemed odd to me. I brought it up with the substitute manager, who also became concerned. It turns out that she didn't actually like blowing up the balloons, so once she had sold out, she would just spend the rest of her shift walking around and enjoying the sunshine. She was ordered that the moment she got down to 2 or 3 balloons, she had to come in and get more. I think the only reason she wasn't fired was because she was pregnant. The day after this happened, she burst into the kitchen at about midday and told me to take over balloons before going on her lunch. I gladly agreed, glad to be out of the soft play area, and began to fill up the balloons and tie them off. It was really frustrating and took about 40 minutes, but eventually I finished and stood back to admire my work. Almost imminently, after I'd tied off the bunch, waltzed Stan into the balloons, shooing me back to the kitchen. I frowned and told her that she had told me that I would be taking over balloons. She laughed and said that she had just decided that she wanted to do it again. It clicked right away that all she wanted from me was to fill up the balloons for her while she goofed off for a bit. I stormed back into the kitchen, completely pissed off. The manager imminently called me over and asked me where I'd been for the last 40 minutes. I told him I'd been in the back room filling up balloons for Kay, which he didn't like as it meant Kay had been skipping work again. He radioed her to ask her if this was true. She of course denied it, and I lost an hour's pay. I was furious with her. I spent the last few weeks cooped up in a grimy, disgusting kitchen, being yelled at by entitled parents and idiotic kids, while she got to do my job without any of the hard bits. That night I went home seething and covered head to toe in ketchup that a 5-year-old had squirted all over my one company shirt. Yes, they were very stingy. Now comes the good bit. The next day she went out on balloons as usual, having got a member of the early morning staff to fill up some balloons for her, and left me in the kitchen. I was ridiculously busy and very hot. I would have given anything to be outdoors on a day like this. Once again, at midday, she came in to ask me to take over from balloons, somehow thinking I'd be dumb enough to make the same mistake twice. I had, however, concocted a plan and went to do so. When I was first being trained, I had been told numerous times to only fill up balloons as little as possible, since the gas could expand if it was hot and they would pop. Since she had treated me like crap and I knew she wouldn't check, I decided to overfill each balloon, just so it was on the verge of full capacity. When she predictably came back and took them off me, I waved her off with a smile. I figured all that would happen was maybe one would pop and give her a fright. Maybe if I was lucky, one of the guests would complain and I would get my favorite job back. Oh, how much better it was. A few hours later, we got a call through the park to evacuate. Everyone was ushered out and multiple SWAT teams poured into the park. The country was currently on high terrorist alert, and given that this was a high-risk area, everyone was pretty on edge. All of the customers were sent home, and we were glad to hear that there had been no casualties and no damage had been done at all. It was just a false alarm. Since we had to refund all the customers and the park was cleared for the next few days, the economic impact of this event had been around £300,000, so quite a lot. After the investigation, it turns out that one of Kay's balloons had popped in the heat, causing those around it to pop. These were those enormous foil balloons, and they made quite a lot of noise when they burst. Several members of the public panicked and called the police, telling them that there had been a bombing. Kay was confronted and asked why she allowed the balloons to be so overfilled. She tried to tell the managers and the police that it was me who had filled it up, but since she had changed her name on the shift planner so that it said that she was on balloons, she couldn't wiggle her way out of it. From what I know, she was promptly fired and charged a significant fine by the police. I knew her parents would be able to support her financially, so it didn't bother me that much that I had gotten her fired. She deserved it, really. A few days later, I went back to selling balloons and my sanity made a dramatic comeback. I never meant for it to happen, but I couldn't have been happier with the result. I'd just like to point out, due to a number of comments, that A was not fined because the police was called. She was fined because she gave the statement that was against evidence provided by the park and refused to cooperate, as under the circumstances it was not her that actually called the police. yeah, just if you get anything out of these stories, just know that if you're a jerk to somebody, don't be surprised when karma catches back up with you. Anyways, that's all for today's stories. I'm going to be trying to upload maybe once or twice a day for a while. We'll see how that goes. So, thanks for watching.